is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Germany halts the approval of the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline as the West responds to planned Russian military action in Ukraine.
The UK and US announced sanctions against Russian financial interests. EU foreign ministers are meeting now to agree further measures.
Witnesses report seeing Russian military vehicles in the disputed region of eastern Ukraine after President Putin recognised 2 breakaway states.
And oil surges close to $100 a barrel on the news from Ukraine, but global stocks are broadly stable.
Germany is to suspend the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline after Russia ordered troops into eastern Ukraine and officially recognised the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Describing the situation as fundamentally different, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the pipeline linking Russia to Germany could no longer go into operation. Meanwhile, the UK has released a package of sanctions on Russia, with the EU set to follow.
In a moment, we'll be in Moscow with Stuart Smith and Eastern Ukraine with Stephanie Fried. First, though, let's head to Berlin and talk to Trent Murray. Trent, this news has been welcomed abroad, but it represents real problems in Germany, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this was an extremely surprising announcement by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, I had to say. We saw he had arranged this press conference with the Irish Prime Minister, who was in town. We expected he would take a couple of questions on Ukraine, but we did not expect him to start the press conference by saying he was pulling the plug on Nord Stream 2, one of the most important energy projects this country has seen in decades. Of course, he had been under enormous pressure for months to lay out whether he would take such steps should Vladimir Putin make a decision to invade eastern Ukraine, and he was always very coy, very cagey about giving an answer. Well, today he dismissed that, and he said very clearly that that pipeline would not be going ahead. He effectively has intervened personally as Chancellor. The pipeline is effectively filled with gas right now and is ready to go. It was just going through some final regulatory checks here by authorities in Germany, but he has said that that will now not be happening. He has ordered those regulators to stop the certification process. Let's just have a listen to exactly what the Chancellor had to say.
Of course, we still have further sanctions that we can take in future. But now it is first of all a question of doing something very concrete that relates to the situation that has occurred, and also taking similar measures coordinated between the USA and the European Union. And that will happen.
But as you say, it's a hugely important energy project. So what kind of contingency plans might we see in place?
Well, the big concern, the big immediate concern, is what this decision could mean for the price of energy here in Germany, for average householders who are already seeing their gas bills extremely high because of volatility in the global markets. Now, it's important to note that there is a Nord Stream 1 in all of this, the older pipeline that is continuing to bring gas from Russia to Germany, so we don't sort of expect any major interruption to supply right now. But of course, we know this situation is very, very difficult to predict, things moving extremely quickly. And so already contingency plans being discussed, not just here in Germany, but across Europe, about maybe bringing in extra LNG gas, that gas which is brought in by big container ships from places like Qatar and Norway and the United States. They have all said they're looking to step up production. But I think clearly reading the writing on the wall for the political problems this could cause Chancellor Scholz here domestically, we saw a tweet this afternoon from former Russia President Dmitry Medvedev. He's also, of course, on Putin's Security Council, and he said Chancellor Scholz has halted this project oh well, welcome to a new world where Europeans will soon be paying 2,000 euros per cubic metre of gas. A clear sign that he expects, because of this decision in Berlin, the price of energy will increase here, causing domestic political problems for the Chancellor.
It's important, though, that you reminded us that there is still a Nord Stream 1. Thanks very much, Trent Murray in Berlin.
Well, let's bring in Stuart Smith now, who is in Moscow. So, Stuart, how is all this being received by the Kremlin?
Well, a further announcement of sanctions is no surprise to a Russian president that was well informed that this would be the consequence of taking action, as it has done. So far, we've not yet seen the bumper extreme sanctions that have been promised for a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, but we are already seeing this trickling of promises about what could come if that happens, and some sanctions already being implemented. But Russia is no stranger to sanctions, and the Kremlin emphasised that it would easily be able to brush off their effects with strong federal reserves in Russia's treasury. And also, it's well used to sanctions, having dealt with them for 8 years after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So the Russian perspective is that new sanctions won't make much difference. And also coming under question by the Russian Foreign Ministry was the purpose of sanctions. The Foreign Minister's spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, suggested that these sanctions would have come anyway. Regardless of what Russia does, the intention of the West is to try and curb Russia's development, and therefore any excuse could be given to try to implement further sanctions now. Also, we're hearing that it does not seem to have deterred future action, as right now parliamentarians in Russia's upper house are discussing the need for military action in these just declared independent republics. That would increase the stakes hugely, and seemingly the threat of sanctions has made no change to that decision. The Russian president, speaking to his Azerbaijani counterpart today, was at pains to emphasize, though, that although there does seem to be an escalation of military action abroad, it does not threaten other countries like the former Soviet Republic in Azerbaijan.
Russia decided to recognize the sovereignty of the two Donbass People's Republics. I can say that we saw and foresaw all the speculations on this subject, that Russia is going to restore the empire of its imperial borders. That's not true, absolutely. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia accepted all the new political realities.
So, Stuart, looking at world markets, Russian stocks and the ruble have taken something of a pounding. What could the repercussions of this be?
Indeed, the sanctions themselves are focused on high net worth individuals close to the Russian president, and also the banking sector with the intention to try to prevent international payments. It's not the kind of thing that in itself would affect ordinary Russians, which is a deliberate choice by countries looking at sanctions. However, indeed, the ruble plummeting and stocks and share prices falling will have an impact on ordinary Russians, and indeed at a time in Russia when food prices are unusually high due to high levels of inflation, a falling ruble is only likely to make that problem worse. That's where I think ordinary citizens will start to feel some pain going into this new period in Russia's history.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you very much.
Well, let's head to Ukraine now, and Stephanie Fried. She's in the city of Mariupol in the contested region of Donetsk. Stephanie, these sanctions, is it what Ukraine had been hoping for?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that would boost confidence, not only within the Ukraine government figures, but also among Ukrainians. And, you know, as you can see here behind me, people are turning out. They're talking a lot about fear. Earlier in the day, the people that I spoke with, they're talking about having an emergency plan, about being ready to go on the fly with documents, passports, money in a bag that's already packed and ready to go. But these kinds of measures, and certainly just the spirit and nature of Ukrainians, they're defiant. And this is a rally here behind me in the center of Mariupol. People have turned out. They're saying no to Russian aggression. Glory to Ukraine. They've also talked about fighting, and they will fight. They will not allow territory to be taken over. So, yes, absolutely, decisions by Germany, by the EU members, that will build confidence, or it does bolster confidence.
Stephanie, you've been talking to us throughout the day, and there weren't the crowds that were earlier that there are now behind you. I mean, is this what's happening across Donetsk and neighbouring Luhansk?
Well, in Donetsk and Luhansk, there's been quite a bit of shelling throughout the country. There are these types of rallies that are gathering. Absolutely. There is, perhaps it's a way people have said to quash the fears that they have over what possibly could happen, a widespread invasion, especially with sightings that have been talked about within Donetsk of unmarked vehicles, military vehicles that are believed to be Russian vehicles. So yes, people are turning out. They want their voices to be heard. And again, the slogan that we're hearing here again and again and in other rallies is long live Ukraine, and we will not stand any Russian aggression.
Stephanie Fried in Ukraine, thank you very much for the update.
So ahead on Global Business Europe, we'll have more details on Western sanctions against Russia. With Nordstrom halted, the oil price spiking, we look at what the crisis in Ukraine means for global energy supplies.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
China has urged all sides in the Ukraine crisis to exercise restraint and to resolve differences through dialogue and consultation.
Its foreign ministry emphasised earlier comments made by the foreign minister Wang Yi, saying any country's legitimate security concerns must be respected.
The purpose and the principles in the UN Charter should be upheld by all. The evolution of the Ukraine issue is closely related to the delayed implementation of the Minsk New Agreement. China will continue to engage with all parties on the merits of the case. This situation in Ukraine is getting worse. China again is calling on all parties to exercise restraint.
Meanwhile, the United States is set to announce sanctions against Russia for what it's described as a clear violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, our correspondent Caroline Malone is in Washington, D.C. for us. So, Caroline, what's the latest reaction from the United States and from the UN?
We've actually just heard in the last few moments from US media that a White House national security official is describing Russia's move into Ukraine as an invasion. and that the US is planning to introduce more sanctions. This, of course, since Russia declared Donetsk and Luhansk independent territories and put what they call peacekeeping troops there. Globally, though, that's really viewed as foreign forces infiltrating Ukraine's sovereign territory. And President Biden has already signed an executive order stopping any financial transactions or business with those regions. And those sanctions are really to stop Russia from profiting from the move, but also without penalising ordinary Ukrainians. Members of the United Nations Security Council did meet last night on Monday, and they called out President Putin's actions as hostile. The US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, called it a clear violation of international law. Let's have a listen to more of what she had to say.
He tore the Minsk agreements to shred, and as the Secretary General said earlier today, he violated the UN Charter. Just now, my Russian counterpart made assertions without evidence that demonstrate their efforts to create a pretext for conflict, and it is alarming. It's revealing and it's shameful.
So what else does the White House have lined up when it comes to dealing with this?
Well, the White House has already welcomed the halt of the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline, which is meant to, of course, supply Europe, particularly Germany, with gas and would have profited Moscow in particular. Global markets have plummeted on the results of that and, of course, all the movements within Ukraine. But energy prices are surging right now. But there are still concerns, really, for an all-out invasion, or even that Russian troops may move further into Ukraine from that Donbass region. And the West is very concerned, particularly about the language that Putin used in a speech on Monday, saying they see it as an attempt to redraw post-Cold War boundaries, and with the potential, essentially, to take over Ukraine. So the next steps from Russia are not clear, but US President Biden has spoken to the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, as well as the leaders of France and Germany. And the US has got these other sanctions prepared as an option, and we're hearing now potentially that those will be introduced. Members of Congress here had already asked Biden to introduce more sanctions, particularly on Russia. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman has actually labelled Moscow's action as an act of unprovoked aggression, and additional Russian troops, if they should cross into Donbass, that the Biden administration must impose crushing sanctions. Others, including Senator Sherrod Brown, who's the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, said he wants more sanctions now, including against Putin himself. At the same time, the State Department has actually moved personnel from Ukraine into Poland overnight. They may move back and forward between those two countries. We're expecting to hear actually from President Biden later today, and also from the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's going to be holding a press conference alongside the Ukrainian foreign minister.
Caroline Malone, thank you very much for that update.
The UK has imposed sanctions against Russia, targeting 5 banks and freezing the assets of wealthy individuals. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson is in Oxford. Andrew, so Britain's got this first phase of economic sanctions planned. Did they pack a punch?
A punch, that's a difficult word to describe in financial terms at this stage, because we're stacking that up against sanctions that have been pushed against Russian nationals since going back to 2014. As far as the Americans are concerned, we're looking at Brussels cancelling or putting on hold the Nord Stream 2 contract. Those are real measures that have been pushed against the Kremlin. Today, the Prime Minister stands up in the House of Commons and announced sanctions on 3 high net worth Russian individuals and 5 Russian banks. Those banks, Rossiya, IS, Black Sea Bank, General Bank and Promsvyazbank. Well, there are bigger banks he could have gone after. There's the Gazprom Bank, there's Sberbank, there's VTB Bank, which are the banks, the Russian banks that people speculated would be the subject of sanctions, but it seems they haven't been targeted as yet. And those 3 high net worth individuals, Gennady Timchenko, Boris and Igor Rotenberg, uncle and nephew, they are very close to the Putin camp, there's no doubt about that, but they principally occupy their areas of business within Russia. There are plenty of other high net worth Russian individuals who are resident in the UK or practice their businesses in the UK that the government could have gone after. So yes, indeed, this must be considered a first tranche. And indeed, the Prime Minister said just that, implying that he had more up his sleeve should that be necessary. But the language was strong. As you can hear now from the House of Commons, British government is quite clear on the matter that they condemn what's going on as far as the Russian military activity in Ukraine is concerned, and they stand shoulder to shoulder with their European neighbours. Listen to this.
it is precisely because the stakes are so high that Putin's venture in Ukraine must fail, must ultimately fail, and must be seen to fail.
Now, just as we heard within Congress in the United States, there are plenty more on the right of Boris Johnson's party who feel he should have gone much further already, previous leader of the Tory party, Ian Duncan Smith, being one of them. There are some in the government's party who think by now there should be a division of NATO troops on Ukrainian soil, face-to-face across the border with Russian troops. So there are plenty of different grades of reaction already being recommended and pushed towards the Prime Minister in terms of taking it further. I think with these unexplained wealth orders and asset freezing orders that have now come into legislation, there will be a gradual, consistent pursuit of high net worth Russian individuals in the UK, which may or may not be part of announced sanctions or just part of a general disruptive programme. There are 2,500 Russians who have residency visas for practising business in the UK, all of whom are potential targets for UK government investigations. So there is plenty more that the Prime Minister can be doing or could be doing, and there's plenty more he could have done already. I think there'll be different voices in his party. But if this is just a first tranche, then he's got plenty more options if the situation escalates even further.
Andrew, let's talk about the shape or the future shape politically in Europe, because they've recently been seen as divided, particularly over Brexit, over Afghanistan, over immigration. Are there signs, do you think, that with this Ukraine crisis that might be changing?
I think that's what people are reaching for. Certainly there's been plenty of speculation by international observers over the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the immigration issues in the European Union, even Brexit, the relationship between the UK and the European Union, that it's becoming a divided, fractured community, that the West isn't what it once was. But if you stack up the two big economies, the European bloc and the American economy, they do, and to use your phrase from the previous question, pack quite a punch. The Russians, their economy is only a little bit underneath the size of Italy's. And so there's plenty of money around, if it's united, to start putting pressure on the Russian economy. I think the signs are thus far, and from this very recent a press conference by the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg that we just heard, there is a fair amount of commitment within NATO and in Brussels as well to push this as hard as it needs to be pushed. And we haven't yet heard from Antony Blinken or Joe Biden clearly on this matter today. So I think there is a real move to make the noises of unification and to also make gestures, unified gestures, to show that Europe is resolute about this military activity on its borders and not content just to sit on its hands as it might have done or been perceived to have done back in 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea. This time round may be where the Kremlin is perceived to have gone too far, and that may draw something more unified from Europe and America than we have seen in recent years and months.
Whatever the sequencing of these sanctions, this won't be easy. Britain must work with our European allies to handle the disruption in the supply of energy and raw materials. We must defend ourselves and our allies against cyber attacks. We must bring together the widest possible coalition of nations to condemn this action against a sovereign UN member state.
Well, there you go. That's Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition. Now, up until a week ago, he only had knives for Boris Johnson over the parties being held in Downing Street and all the other issues of COVID. That has all been put aside. So as a sign of the unity being built, we can now see that those voices raised against each other in the British political scene have now quietened. There'll be full loyalty from the opposition party in terms of dealing with this international crisis in Ukraine. And that's a sign that bygones are bygones already on the political scene in the UK, and it's likely to be the case as well across Europe and with Washington as well.
Andrew Wilson, thank you.
The Ukraine crisis has another unintended victim, the global energy supply.
The sector has barely recovered from the impact of the pandemic. Crude oil prices hit a record $99 a barrel on Tuesday, the highest in more than 7 years.
Dr. Thomas W. O'Donnell is an energy analyst with the Hertie School of Governance, and he joins us from Berlin. Great to have you with us on the programme today. So, firstly, Germany has stopped the approval of the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline. There are huge implications economically and for supply, aren't there?
Yes, there are. There were 5 European companies that invested half the money for this pipeline, which was a very controversial thing for them to do. And, you know, that's half of about $11 billion. The other half, of course, was Gazprom. So that's, you know, that's a loss for them. This pipeline, I would venture to say this pipeline will never come online. The fact that it wasn't online already was a victory for all the countries in Europe and the United States who fought very hard to prevent it from coming online as a diversion pipeline to avoid, for Putin to avoid having to send his gas across Ukraine.
So you think there's no future for Nord Stream 2?
I'd say it's very, very unlikely. I don't think Putin's going to reverse course. This has already been called an invasion, and the President of the United States made it clear, if there's an invasion, there will be no pipeline. So the Germans, rightfully, have taken the first step since they were the partners with Putin in this, with Gazprom in this, and they've suspended the consideration of the pipeline. The pipeline will not go forward for now. But I think it'll become, Mr. Putin is not going to stop, and the United States President, Congress, and so forth, and the European Union perhaps also will put sanctions. There's a good chance this will never go online. Putin has sacrificed it.
But even without Nord Stream 2, though, Russia's the largest supplier of natural gas and oil to the EU last year. So if Russia's supplies aren't available, who or what could fill the gap?
Well, now this is a pipeline that wasn't online yet, okay? So there are two other pipelines that are currently sending gas from Russia to Europe. Now, what Russia has done is is only supplied for several months now gas that was long-term contracts. Normally in the spot market, it provides extra gas to fill the reserves in Europe, and it refused to do that. Those reserves are the lowest of natural gas than they've been in a long, long time. So they're in a precarious situation if Russia cuts off this other gas that is still sending. So what makes up for that? Actually, in the month of January, for most of January, American LNG supplied more gas to Europe, several times more than Russian gas by pipeline, unheard of. The price was very high, gas was diverted from Asia, and it came. Qatar has agreed to do everything they can, the next biggest producer, to send LNG. But if Putin cuts off the two big pipelines that still supply gas to Europe, it will not be possible for those LNG ships to replace that. There'll be an energy crisis in Europe. That's, yes.
So an energy crisis, you say. What do you think could fill that gap? Obviously, people will still need gas. How will they get it?
Well, at a certain point, you don't get it, right? This was, let's just say it, a mistake that Europe, and in particular Germany, made for overdependence on Russian gas. They were warned by this from the Americans going back to the Reagan administration when the first pipelines were built. France and Germany promised Mr. Reagan they would be no more than 15% dependent on Russia, and of course that increased over the years, building newer and more pipelines. The Americans warned them, and various other European countries, the Poles and others, warned Europe that this is the situation you get in, and that's the situation they're in. If those pipelines are cut off by Mr. Putin as part of a war, anything can happen in a war, there'll be an energy crisis, there won't be enough gas, and people have to decide how to ration gas. And the European Commission has looked into ways of doing this.
I also want to ask you about oil prices, because there's already been a huge effect on those due to this crisis. They're very high now. How high could they go?
Okay. Russia, of course, Mr. Putin back in March, April of 2020 launched an oil price war to try and, well, he launched an oil price war as a means of hitting American shale, fracking oil, thinking that if he could get them bankrupt over some years, America wouldn't be able to put sanctions on Russia anymore. This was a complete misunderstanding of how bankruptcy law works and how the oil system works. And within a few days, he was actually calling President Trump to help him get the prince in Saudi Arabia on the phone to end the war that he started. So here we are again. This time, as people are being cured of COVID, as the pandemic is decreasing, production is increasing, and we need more oil. We need more oil. OPEC has been steadily increasing their oil on the market. The problem is a number of OPEC producers have not been able to meet their increased quota. So now if Putin cuts back the oil he's sending to Europe, the price will skyrocket. The Americans will do all they can to produce more. Many countries will. But with the world economy likely taking off, okay, if he cuts back that oil, the price could, as you say, skyrocket. However, here, unlike natural gas, the OECD countries, the first world countries essentially, have a treaty agreement, the strategic petroleum reserves. Every country since the OPEC oil price, the OPEC crisis in the 1970s, has 90 days of supplies of its total imports underground. So the odds for a big crisis, a high price, yes, are different. They probably won't run out of oil because those strategic reserves will be brought online. Europe did not make a strategic reserve for natural gas, as myself and other experts have called for them to do for some time.
Okay, Dr. Thomas W. O'Donnell from Hertie School of Governance. Great to get your thoughts today. Thanks for joining us on the programme.
Great to be here. Bye-bye.
Still ahead, more on the crisis in Ukraine and its global impact. Plus, big bank Hsbc more than doubled its annual profits, but its outlook is marred by headwinds in Asia.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and me, Juliet Mann. The headlines again. Germany halts the approval of the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline, and in the last few minutes, Russia's parliament has approved a request from Vladimir Putin to deploy military forces outside the country.
Meanwhile, the United Kingdom and United States announced sanctions against Russian financial interests. EU foreign ministers are meeting now to agree further measures.
And oil surges close to $100 a barrel on the news from Ukraine, but global stocks are broadly stable.
Well, let's go now to the Ukrainian capital, where we can join our correspondent Guy Henderson. Guy, tell us, what's the reaction been where you are to the day's events?
Well, we've got a reaction from a senior Ukrainian government official. His name is
Mikhailo Podolyak. He is a senior advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky. We met him in his office at the president's office building, and we sat down and interviewed him. The first thing I wanted absolute clarity from the Ukrainian government on is exactly at what point the Ukrainian military would be prepared to engage with Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine. Not when soldiers entered separatist-controlled areas, he told me. Not even if they were to fire upon Ukrainian soldiers along the contact line, if they could possibly avoid it. But there was a point, he said, at which the Ukrainian military would make a decision to fight back.
Of course, the Ukrainian army will not conduct any offensive operations. However, we will defend ourselves if Russia tries to occupy Ukrainian government-held territory.
Well, I also asked him about that German decision to put a halt on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline by Germany. And I have to say he wasn't particularly impressed by that move. In his view, it was not something he thought was going to shift Vladimir Putin's thinking significantly. He said that only the very toughest sanctions, led specifically, he said, by the United States, and he specified that sanctions such as freezing foreign bank accounts of those who are closely linked to the Kremlin, those were the only measures that he thought would be harsh enough to force Vladimir Putin to prefer the option of negotiating, of coming back to the negotiating table over military action. Just a final point as well. I asked him what he thought, what the thinking was in the president's office at the moment about the chances of a wider conflict now, a full-scale invasion. His answer was that and quite a firm answer, was that he did not think that that was particularly likely at the moment, and his reasoning for that was that he said the cost of human lives was already going to be significant for Russia if there was fighting in the east, and he seemed to think that a fuller-scale invasion across a broader swathe of Ukraine would just be too costly on human lives, and that would come at a great political cost to Vladimir Putin back home in Russia.
Guy Henderson in Kiev, many thanks.
The head of NATO has welcomed the sanctions announced against Russia by the UK and the EU. In the past few moments, Jens Stoltenberg responded to Russia's official recognition of two disputed regions in East Ukraine and its decision to send in troops. And he had a stark warning for NATO members.
We urge Russia in the strongest possible terms to choose the path of diplomacy. This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. But Europe and North America continue to stand strong together in NATO, united and committed to defend and protect each other.
Meanwhile, EU foreign ministers are in Paris deciding on what sanctions they will impose on Russia. Let's talk now to our correspondent there, Ryan Thompson. So, Ryan, tell us about the EU's reaction to Putin's decision.
Well, Robin, the European Union and the 27 foreign ministers within it have had tough words for Moscow, especially since the escalation of events in the last 24 hours. They are meeting here in Paris for an exceptional meeting, building off of a summit earlier this morning that will specifically focus on what measures need to be taken to address these escalating situation between the two countries. It is very clear that sanctions are in order, and EU sources on the ground at the meeting, not so far from here at France's diplomatic hub, the Quai d'Orsay, have said things are moving very fast. This started as a summit in the morning focused on a relationship and issues between Indo-Pacific and Europe. Now they are focused on the Ukraine question. Obviously, this has been the big talk of diplomats for the entire day. And they say that sanctions are very much on the table in order, but it's a question of how far they're going to go, because it's very clear to all of them that at this point, Russia is not willing to reverse its recognition, and it is not committed to abiding by international law and the accords it has signed for many years now that seem to be firmly in place. So the message from the EU chief speaking to reporters over the course of the day, including France Info television, is that he will not, these actions will not go unpunished under any regards. The European Union will be sure of that. It has the backing of the 27 member states. The meetings are underway. We were hoping to have an outcome when we came to air right now, but we're still waiting for those heads of government to come out and address reporters.
Well, as you say, Ryan, we were expecting to have heard from the foreign ministers around about now. Are any decisions looking likely?
Well, according to EU sources, these will be pretty strict sanctions. One big question is whether they can get in agreement with the United States to basically kick Russia off of the global payment system, the SWIFT system as it's known. This will make it much more difficult for these leaders in Russia, but also politicians, banks, industries, government to move money around. The sanctions potentially could go as far as impacting the Russian central bank, which would have a real crippling effect on the Russian economy in the coming months should they provoke further action. One thing that we've heard earlier in the day is that when it comes to having the 27 member states on board, it also appears that Hungary is fully on board, despite having closer ties to Moscow than some other EU nations in the past. They are willing to press ahead with action. Having the support of those eastern states will be key here. And the basic understanding we have of what sanctions will be taking shape and how severe they will be, well, 27 people and institutions will be concerned. That's everything from finance groups, businesses, and government and military leaders. That's, of course, in addition to 351 members of the Russian parliament who voted towards this recognition, supporting the act. It does seem to EU leaders here that they are very much heeding the calls and the message request from the Ukrainian president for them to press ahead with as tough of sanctions as they can on Russia. Here was him speaking on Ukrainian television last night.
Europe and the world cannot allow a repetition of the tragic mistakes made in Georgia in 2008. We agreed on the necessity of immediately imposing sanctions for another action of aggression against Ukraine. These sanctions must include the complete shutdown of Nordstrom 2. Moreover, Ukraine as never before needs its partners' support of its defense capacity as well as support of its economic stability.
Now, of course, pushing for as much as he can get here, that is the message from the Ukrainian president. We are carefully monitoring to see whether the EU foreign ministers will go full in, as some have called for, or if they will be a bit softer. We know it's a little bit of a game east versus west here. They have yet to take to the podium, but we will be watching very closely as the night rolls on.
Absolutely. Ryan Thompson in Paris, many thanks.
Italian authorities have rescued more than 500 migrants from 2 boats in the Mediterranean. The group, including 59 children, was brought to safety after their vessels ran into difficulty in bad weather off the coast of Sicily. The Italian Coast Guard says a body was also recovered.
Hong Kong's population will undergo 3 rounds of compulsory COVID testing starting in March. The city is experiencing its worst outbreak since the pandemic began 2 years ago. Hospitals and isolation centres are running out of space as thousands of people test positive each day. China's central government is helping Hong Kong build temporary facilities.
Volkswagen is in advanced discussions with Porsche to take the luxury sports car maker public to give the brand more independence. The potentially record-breaking deal could be worth between $68 billion to $96 billion. The entire VW group, which also owns brands like Audi, Lamborghini and Bentley, has a current market value of around 112 billion euros.
Hsbc has revealed that its annual profits more than doubled in 2021 and announced plans to repurchase shares worth up to $1 billion.
The London-based bank reported pre-tax profit of $18.9 billion, but the outlook for growth was more gloomy, particularly in its key Chinese market. Well, Michael Hewson is Chief Market Analyst at CMC Markets.
A good set of numbers. Obviously, profits are well above last year. $18.8 billion, with the Asia business contributing pretty much 2/3 of that. Fairly decent performance from the UK bank as well, which is encouraging and is, I think it bodes well for the next 12 months. But there were pockets of weakness, and those pockets of weakness are particularly, I think, in Q4. Profits were half of what they should have been. In my opinion, in Q3, we saw profits of around about $4.2 billion. They came in around about $2 billion in Q4. And I think that's why you've seen a little bit of a reticent response from investors with respect to the share price today.
And talk us through as well that exposure to the Chinese real estate market, which took a bit of a shine off those results.
Yeah, it definitely took a shine off the Q4 element of the results, a $500 million provision for non-performing loans. And let's not forget, over the course of the past 12 months, HSBC has been adding back provisions in respect of non-performing loans because the COVID pandemic response wasn't anywhere near as bad as perhaps they thought it would be. So I think that is a little bit of an unwelcome development going forward. Profits of potentially of half of what they should have been in Q4. And the outlook more broadly, the HSBC have warned about the outlook, particularly in wealth management in Asia going forward, downgrading their expectations for that. So that has tempered, I think, today's market response to those numbers. Good news, however, a dividend of 18 cents a share and also an additional $1 billion buyback, which will be implemented once the existing $2 billion buyback has finished.
Well, investors always love a dividend payment, don't they? Look, the bank is UK-based, but Asia-focused. So let's talk about that pivot and how that strategy is serving them.
Well, in terms of profits, it's serving them very, very well. You know, $12.6 billion of profits from the Asia business. But I think management were fairly conservative about their expectations for Q1. The shares are up over 40% from their lows back at the beginning of Q4, well above 540p at this point in time. I think there is concern about the outlook for China, as indicated by that provision of $500 million with respect to the Chinese real estate sector. And I also think there is concern about the outlook more broadly in Asia because of the zero COVID policy of the Chinese government. That is likely to temper profit expectations going forward. Indeed, HSBC have warned about the effect that it will have on their wealth management division in the first quarter of this year.
And Michael, how about Hong Kong? They do a good deal of business there. With the COVID restrictions in place, what kind of impact might they have?
I think, again, it's likely to have an overhang in terms of the profit potential in the first quarter. Now, whether or not that improves in the second or third quarter of this year, that remains to be seen. But it's certainly very much a headwind for all of the Asia business going forward.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Overworked and underfunded. Spanish nurses say the pandemic has taken a physical and mental toll and demand better investment in healthcare.
This is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Nurses and physiotherapists in Spain have been demonstrating against what they describe as the collapse of the country's healthcare system.
Protesters claim a lack of resources is making their jobs impossible and putting patients' health at risk. Rahul Pathak reports from Madrid.
Now, this is one of a series of protests taking place simultaneously right across the country. Spanish nurses and physiotherapists making a stand over what they say is a chronic lack of investment and resources in the healthcare industry.
We've been dealing with this issue for a very long time, and the pandemic has made the situation worse. The main problem is simply a lack of health workers.
A lot of young people simply couldn't cope with the pressure, so many of them quit.
Now, they've claimed that the huge increase in workload has led to a worsening in the quality of care they can provide, and that has been evident in the backlog of surgery, consultancy and tests. Now, on average, nurses care for around 20 to 25 patients in one shift, plus up to 4 people within intensive care units. The safety ratio set by Spain's National Health Service is actually 8 patients. Now, these healthcare workers are demanding a change as the crisis has taken a physical and mental toll on the well-being of those within the healthcare industry. Now, the government of Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has stated that public health spending will increase by 2% a year for the next decade. Now, the health workers here say the lack of job security, low wages and mental strain has deterred many from entering the profession. And for the 400,000 nurses and physiotherapists who have endured some of the toughest working conditions in recent history, they will certainly hope that those issues can be addressed and addressed soon. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Economists say Venezuela has finally emerged from more than 4 years of hyperinflation.
But many say they're waiting to see the evidence as families and businesses continue to feel the pinch from soaring prices. Mary Trini Mena reports from Caracas.
The sweet treats are popular at this Caracas bakery, but running the business for the past 4 years during Venezuela's hyperinflation has been bittersweet.
At first, we didn't have supplies. Now we have them, but prices change daily.
The bakery has adjusted. For 4 years, the price of ingredients rose by more than 1,000% annually. But Venezuela has just completed 12 months below the threshold of hyperinflation, with inflation below 50%. That's lower than before, but still hard on the pocketbook.
Nosotros en un mes tenemos la inflación que tiene Estados Unidos en todo un año.
In a single month, we have more inflation than the United States does in a whole year. Venezuela's inflation last year was 686%, and in North America, it will be 6 or 7%. The magnitude of our inflation is greater than in the rest of the world.
In 2020, inflation was almost 3,000%, a sign things are better here, but not much. The local currency, the Bolivar, has lost almost 99% of its value in just over a decade. There are reports the government is paying providers in US dollars.
2 years ago, the Venezuelan government started to take some measures to relax economic controls and allow foreign currencies to circulate freely. Now, most Venezuelans use the US dollar for everyday transactions, even though most salaries are paid in bolivars.
Oil production nearly doubled in 2021 after record lows, helping the country.
The way out of hyperinflation depends on the oil market, on the increase in oil production. As always in Venezuela, crude oil prices rely on their volatility and the stability of the national oil industry.
Meanwhile, inflation continues to be a reality for millions of Venezuelans trying to keep up with prices still rising, but not as steeply as before. Maritrini Mena, CGTN, Caracas.
Big shoulders, bustiers and anything pink. This London Fashion Week showcased the trends we'll all be wearing in coming months.
Leo Chunyang reports.
Dressing up is back. After 2 years that saw the COVID pandemic push fashion onto the back burner, people are once again gathering in London to explore the colour and creativity the city is famous for. The 2022 London Fashion Week has seen a mix of established names returning and rising stars arriving to showcase their talents.
London Fashion Week is very much about the international buyers and media coming and seeing the collections that will be on sale in 6 months' time. But we've had fantastic appetite from the department stores, from the US, from Europe, those independent boutiques.
In China, designer Wang Fengchen has been making a splash in independent boutiques across the country, and is now one of the big names to watch in the industry. Her designs were showcased at the Beijing Winter Games as the official uniforms of the Olympic flag bearers. She's now bringing her autumn 2022 collection to London, featuring comfy, casual, unisex designs with a unique Chinese flavor.
The history of these neckwear almost more than 700 years in my hometown, and when I go back to my hometown, visiting a lot of artists' studios still making that, and then that inspired me a lot. And this time I bring out the material, which is very, very connected to this technique. And also there's a lot of craftsmanship from China.
Wang herself is unable to join the show in person due to COVID travel restrictions. She believes that the whole industry needs to adapt to the fundamental changes the pandemic has brought to the world of fashion.
When people cannot travel, but people look at online things even more than before, but we still connect to each other, and we don't necessarily to work physically in person, but still conquer every day. Even sometimes the campaign come out as a digital fashion show, a digital communication. Everything become easier actually in some way.
This year's hybrid event has seen more than 130 designers share their work with audiences around the world, using a mix of physical and digital catwalks. Fashion Week usually brings more than £270 million and thousands of jobs into Britain. It may not be on the same scale of similar events in Paris and Milan, but the success of this year's return to the catwalk represents a vote of confidence in the future of fashion. Liu Chunyang, CGTN, London.
Our headlines again. Germany halts the approval of the Nordstrom 2 gas pipeline, and in the last few minutes, Russia's parliament has approved a request from Vladimir Putin to deploy military forces outside the country.
The United Kingdom and United States announced sanctions against Russian financial interests. EU foreign ministers are meeting now to agree further measures.
And witnesses report seeing Russian military vehicles in the disputed region of eastern Ukraine, as President Putin tells reporters the best thing for Ukraine would be to renounce its NATO membership ambitions. But while we've been on air, the head of NATO has issued a stark warning to the members of the alliance.
We urge Russia in the strongest possible terms to choose the path of diplomacy. This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. But Europe and North America continue to stand strong together in NATO, united and committed to defend and protect each other.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.